We go back to a cold November night in the American heartland, specifically to Lake Superior, a vast inland sea of fresh water, where the wind builds waves with the same relentless power as any ocean. In that setting, a steel freighter, built for reliability and precision, vanishes without a distress call. The ship's name was Edmund Fitzgerald. She had been celebrated for her size, her strength, and the confidence she inspired on the Great Lakes. Caught in a storm that shifted course and defied every forecast, she went silent, and the search and rescue system scrambled across frozen, churning water. The loss was total. The ship was gone. 29 men lost their lives, leaving behind no account from the bridge, no final transmission that could explain those last minutes. What remained was a sequence reconstructed from radio logs, radar contacts, weather records, and what was eventually found on the lake bottom. And what endured, across the decades, was a question that refuses to be buried. Crewed by experienced men move from a difficult but manageable crossing to a complete and sudden disappearance? The answer doesn't rest on a single cause. It rests on a chain. Operational decisions, design tolerances, the behavior of waves over a long exposed deck, the condition of hatches and vents, the real pumping capacity of the bilge system, and what happens when a flexible hull is pushed to its limits by a combination of cargo weight and heavy seas. Welcome to Silent Journals. Before we begin tonight's journey, if you find peace in these quiet spaces of memory and reflection, simply lay back and let the story unfold. Let's begin. The Great Lakes are a working system, not just a landscape. Their routes connect ore ports to industrial centers, turning open water into a vital supply corridor. Lake Superior, the largest, and arguably the most demanding, holds a quality that experienced mariners learn over years. It can shift from calm to punishing with startling speed, especially in November. Cold air settles in. Low-pressure systems deepen, and the wind finds a wide-open surface where it can push without interruption for hours. The result isn't just wave height. It's a short, steep swell capable of striking with steady rhythm, loading the deck with heavy water, and forcing the hull to flex again and again. To understand why the Edmund Fitzgerald existed at all, it helps to look back a few decades. During the industrial expansion of the mid-20th century, a major infrastructure project took shape. The Street, Lawrence Seaway, a system of canals, dredged channels, and locks allowing ships of certain dimensions to travel between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic. With that corridor in place, companies began looking for larger, more efficient vessels to move iron ore. One of them, Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, decided to invest in Great Lakes shipping and commissioned a freighter as large as the system would allow. Construction began at River Rouge, Michigan. The keel was laid, first the long structural backbone running the full length of the ship's bottom, from bow to stern. The foundation, everything else rests on. Around that foundation, the rest of the structure rose using prefabricated sections lifted by crane and assembled in place. A method already pointing toward the efficiency that would define industrial shipbuilding. The cost was considerable for its time. The launch was a public event. The ship was christened Edmund Fitzgerald. The launching ceremony carried details that stayed in collective memory long afterward. There were difficulties completing the traditional bottle breaking. And when the hull entered the water, she slid farther than expected, striking the opposite wall of the channel. It was a tense ceremony, yet the real work of the ship was about to begin. A life of repeated crossings in an environment that combines heavy industry with weather that answers to no schedule. In terms of sheer size, the Fitzgerald pushed the limits of her era. She was long, extraordinarily long, from bow to stern. She was wide, and she rode deep in the water, her hull reaching down to maximize cargo capacity through shallow channels and passages. Her gross tonnage placed her among the largest vessels ever to work the lakes and on the Great Lakes. That distinction meant something. The design followed the classic logic of Great Lakes bulk carriers. Two raised structures at either end, with a long cargo section running between them. Those raised sections are called superstructures, the enclosed spaces built above the main deck, housing crew quarters, offices, and navigation equipment. Forward, the superstructure held officer accommodations and rest areas. Above it sat the wheelhouse, where steering, communications, and the instruments needed to guide the ship through low visibility were concentrated. Between the forward and aft superstructures stretched a long, exposed deck. The spar deck flat, open to the elements, lined with hatches. Those hatches were rectangular steel covers through which taconite pellets were loaded into the holds below. Beneath them lay large cargo spaces, where ore accumulated. Notably, the Fitzgerald's cargo holds were not fully divided by watertight bulkheads' internal walls designed to stop flooding from spreading compartment to compartment. Instead, the internal layout offered more continuity, and that structural choice wasn't necessarily a flaw. But it entirely dictated what would happen if water breached the cargo holds with force. Outside the main cargo line, the ship carried ballast tanks, spaces filled with seawater, or emptied to adjust stability and draft as she loaded and unloaded. These tanks help keep her balanced and can provide some buffer if a section sustains damage. But everything depends on where the water enters, how fast, and how stability responds when the ship is already sitting low and heavy. The engine room was aft. There, a steam turbine drove the ship. Steam was generated in boilers' large systems, where fuel heats water to produce high-pressure steam that spins the turbine and ultimately turns the propeller shaft. For the work the Fitzgerald was built to do, her power and top speed were a real operational advantage, allowing schedules to be met with efficiency, as long as the weather cooperated. In her early years, the ship drew admiration for both her size and the quality of her interior spaces, unusual for a working freighter. She became a familiar presence along shoreline communities. On the Great Lakes, large vessels pass close to coast, navigate rivers and canals, and are often visible from shore as part of daily life. That familiarity, though, doesn't reduce risk. It can, in fact, obscure it. Because the same route, run 100 times, can create a sense of safety that the lake is under no obligation to honor. Over time, the Fitzgerald accumulated the minor incidents typical of operating a massive vessel through tight passages: wall contacts, agrounding, repair work. In 1969, she received a meaningful upgrade, a bow thruster, a transverse propeller mounted near her bow and used at low speed to assist with maneuvering in port, making turns and docking easier without full tugboat support. In the years that followed, her boiler system was converted from coal to oil, simplifying both operation and maintenance. There were also regulatory changes that affected her margin in heavy weather. Among them was a reduction in freeboard, the gap between the waterline and the main deck. Less freeboard means the ship rides lower when fully loaded. That allows more cargo. But it also means waves begin washing over the deck sooner, depositing water weight where it doesn't belong. In moderate conditions, the difference may seem minor. In a storm, it can shift everything. By 1975, the Fitzgerald was not considered old by freshwater standards, provided maintenance had kept pace. Toward the end of the navigation season, her deck areas had been inspected in preparation for winter layup. Some hatch covers showed wear, cracking, and small cuts. The assessment was that they might allow some water in, but the ship's pumping systems were expected to handle any seepage. She carried multiple bilge pumps designed to remove water from internal spaces, and on a working freighter, those pumps are not a secondary feature. They are a safety layer, and their true value is measured in how much water they can move when the sea is determined to send more in. Taconite pellets were her standard cargo iron ore processed and compacted into small spheres for efficient bulk transport. The loading operation at the superior docks was methodical and well-practiced. The ship aligned precisely, hatches opened, chutes positioned, and ore flowed continuously until the holds were full. Within hours, the Fitzgerald rode heavy in the water, riding closer to the surface than she had at dawn. On November 9th, the Fitzgerald departed with a full load. The lake that morning appeared manageable. At the same time, far to the southwest, a weather system was forming and moving northeast. In theory, its predicted path would not take it directly across Superior. In practice, the system crossed over the lake and reorganized the wind pattern entirely. Winds reached extraordinary strength, and the wave train grew until it became the dominant force governing every decision on board. In those conditions, even a large ship is subject to the most basic physics. Every wave adds energy. Every impact demands structural response. And every foot of water on deck adds weight exactly where it's least welcome. On that passage, another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was following a similar route. Its role in the subsequent reconstruction would prove decisive, because it maintained radio contact with the Fitzgerald and tracked her at a distance throughout the crossing. As afternoon deepened and warnings were issued, standard procedures activated aboard both vessels: securing deck equipment, checking seals, monitoring pumps, holding extra watches. The sea was building. The wind was settling in. And with darkness came the work of navigating under reduced visibility, dependent on instruments, not eyes. This is where radar becomes essential to understand. Radar emits radio waves and reads the echoes to detect coastlines, vessels, and obstacles even when visibility has collapsed. In snow, rain, or spray, radar becomes the ship's extended sense, not a convenience, but a necessity. On Superior that night, with visibility obliterated by squalls and spume, radar was the only means of seeing what lay ahead. Freighters on the lakes choose routes that balance distance against protection. A more northerly course hugs Canadian waters and can offer partial shelter from certain wind directions, though it adds miles. That kind of decision is made weighing forecast data, local experience, and the actual state of the sea. That night, Lake Superior offered no generosity. Waves formed with persistence. Cold was fixing itself to every exposed metal surface. Movement on the open deck became a deliberate act, every step measured, every hatch sealed, every closure checked for a reason. The Fitzgerald pushed forward, and the Anderson kept her as a reference, first visually, then by instrument. In those hours, the operational goal was simple: reach a sheltered sector, a bay, where landmass would break the direct force of the wind. That idea, simple on a chart, becomes a continuous calculation on the water speed, heading, margin, distance to shore, distance to shallow hazards, and the persistent question of whether the ship is gaining shelter or losing control. The story of the Fitzgerald from this point forward is built on reliable fragments, recorded radio transmissions, estimated positions, measured meteorology, and what was later found on the lake bottom. There is no final voice from the bridge that closes the sequence. That is why every technical detail matters. Every system and every margin becomes part of the only account that remains the one reconstructed from outside. With discipline, with care, and with respect for the men who did not come home. November 9th was moving toward afternoon with the kind of quiet that, on Lake Superior, sometimes signals nothing more than a pause between systems. The Edmund Fitzgerald had departed with a full cargo of taconite pellets, her course set southeast toward the passages connecting to the rest of the Great Lakes. Under normal conditions, that transit sustains itself on near-mechanical routine: bridge watches, periodic checks, radio reports, and constant attention to the relationship between the ship and the water beneath her. On a freighter of that size, navigation is a sequence of small decisions that accumulate. One of those decisions is heading. Heading isn't just a compass direction, it's the choice of a line across the lake that determines what kind of sea the ship receives. Head seas, with waves arriving from ahead, mean direct impacts and reduced speed. Quarter seas, angling in from the side, can induce rolling and demand frequent corrections. Following seas with waves coming from behind, can push the ship forward, but they also lift and drop sections of the hull in a demanding, repetitive rhythm. On Superior, that geometry shifts quickly when the wind rotates. The storm that had formed far to the southwest brought more than wind. It brought uncertainty. Early forecasts suggested the center of the system would pass to the east of the lake. Instead, it crossed directly over Superior, reorganizing the wind pattern entirely. In open water, wind transfers energy to the surface, organizing it into wave sets. When wind holds its force and direction long enough, waves grow. And when the wind veers quickly, the lake can carry crossed seas, waves arriving from multiple angles, making it far harder for a long ship to find any stable footing. During the night, the Arthur M. Anderson was navigating the same general region. On this particular passage, its presence would become the key to understanding what happened because it maintained radio contact with the Fitzgerald and tracked her at a distance for hours. On a ship, radio isn't social communication. It's a safety system. It allows weather reports, position updates, course changes, and damage notifications to move between vessels. On Superior, in a storm, that exchange of information can be the difference between anticipating a problem and discovering it too late. When gale warnings began transmitting, that information translated into procedure. On deck, securing everything meant verifying that movable elements were fixed against vibration or wave impact. Clamps, cables, attachment points, and most critically, the hatch covers. A hatch cover is a complete system. A steel lid with closing mechanisms, gaskets, and support points. The goal is not a perfect seal against every conceivable condition, but a closure firm enough that water infiltration stays minimal and manageable. The danger arrives when infiltration becomes sustained and outpaces the ship's ability to contain it. In heavy weather, water entering the ship becomes a stability problem. Water in a cargo hold adds weight where the ship never planned for it. Water entering ballast tanks without control can shift the lateral balance. And water accumulating on deck adds elevated weight, raising the center of gravity, increasing the tendency to lean. A persistent lean to one side, called a list, is different from the momentary roll of a passing wave. A list signals that the ship is carrying unequal weight, or that water has settled where it shouldn't be. Through the night, winds intensified. On the water, that intensification doesn't register as a number. It registers as added resistance at the helm, as vibration running through the structure, as repeated blows to the bow, and as water beginning to cross the deck in heavier volumes. In a strong storm, deck water stops being foam and spray. It becomes solid water mass that covers surfaces and lingers when drainage can't keep pace. Old mariners have a phrase for it. When green water starts coming over, the rules change. To understand why a deck can hold water, consider the drainage geometry. Along the sides, the ship carries structural edges meant to channel water toward drains and discharge points. When that system is overwhelmed by large and repeated volumes, water lingers on deck. On a freighter with a long spar deck, that retained mass can concentrate in specific zones, especially if the ship is already riding with a slight forward lean. That forward lean has a name: trim by the head. A ship trimmed by the head is lower at the bow than at the stern. That can result from cargo distribution or from water infiltration, and it causes the forward section of the deck to receive more water, with that water tending to stay near the bow if drainage can't clear it quickly. In a following, or beam sea, that effect worsens. As the two vessels pressed southeast, the Fitzgerald was running ahead. That gap grew over time. Maintaining higher speed can be a tactical choice, reach shelter sooner. But it also means greater exposure if the storm intensifies before safety is reached. At sea, those decisions are made on incomplete information. The forecast can be wrong. Visibility can collapse. Seas can rise within a window shorter than anyone expected. It was during the afternoon that the first clear sign of trouble emerged. Earlier, unusual rolling had been noted. Rolling is the lateral motion of the ship. side to side associated with beam seas or reduced stability. A large freighter tends to roll slowly, but a notable increase can signal a shift in equilibrium or the presence of water where it doesn't belong. The Fitzgerald wasn't known for pronounced rolling, so that observation, while not conclusive in isolation, became a marker worth remembering. Visibility dropped as snow squalls moved through. In that kind of precipitation, the view ahead shrinks to shadow and white noise. The ship stops being visible and becomes an echo on a screen. Radar becomes everything. The Anderson's radar held the Fitzgerald's return ahead and also tracked known hazards along the route: shoals, reefs, and the proximity of the Canadian shore. That region of the lake carries shallow areas and reef systems. On the Great Lakes, hydrographic surveys had been updated over decades, and in some cases, hazards were found to extend beyond what earlier charts showed. That matters when a deeply loaded freighter passes close to a shoal. The margin between safe passage and the hull touching bottom can be smaller than anyone realizes until it isn't. The Anderson observed the Fitzgerald passing near a shoal known for its hazard potential. That proximity doesn't mean the ship grounded. It means the maneuver was executed with reduced clearance. In heavy weather, the risk isn't based only on how deep the ship draws. When the hull rises and falls with the waves, it describes a vertical motion. In a wave trough, the hull can descend toward the bottom. If the actual depth is less than charted, or if the margin was already narrow, the possibility of contact grows. Shortly after, the Fitzgerald called the Anderson. That was a departure until then. The Anderson had been the one initiating contact. The call reported topside damage, a broken railing, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list to starboard. Those vents matter. Ballast tanks and enclosed spaces require ventilation to equalize pressure and allow water in or out. Those vents typically terminate in capped openings on the deck. If a cap is lost, the sea can enter directly into the ballast system or an access tunnel. In a storm, a small protected opening becomes a continuous entry point for water. The Fitzgerald also reported that she was pumping. That word pumping carries weight on a working ship. Running the bilge pumps means actively removing water from spaces where it isn't supposed to be, and the phrase embedded in the transmission made the situation clear. The water was coming in as fast as it could be pumped out. That's not a ship recovering. That's a ship holding its breath. At that moment, conditions were still within the range where no formal distress had been declared. No Mayday was issued. The absence of one may mean the crew believed they could reach shelter. It may mean the degradation that followed happened very quickly. It may mean the situation changed faster than anyone could respond to. What matters is that, at that hour, the Fitzgerald was still moving forward. While both vessels raced toward Whitefish Bay, urgent advisories were transmitting and key passages were closing down. The locks at Salt Sweet, Marie suspended operations due to the storm. That concentrated every navigational goal into a single objective: reach the bay and wait. Several ships were already anchored inside, holding position with their hooks down, riding out the worst of it. That evening brought another hard blow to the Fitzgerald. Both radars failed primary and backup. Losing radar in a storm of blowing snow and spray meant navigating nearly blind with respect to shore and hazards. At that point, an alternative activates. Request radar assistance from another vessel. A radar plot from a nearby ship, an estimated position and course based on another ship's screen, allows a vessel to orient her navigation without being able to see. The Fitzgerald requested that assistance from the Anderson. The dynamic became delicate. The Anderson, running behind, was now attempting to guide with its own radar, a process that requires clear communication, accurate echo interpretation, and enough stability in both ships to hold coherent headings. In a severe storm, wave interference can saturate a radar display, crowding the screen with returns from breaking crests. Beyond the radar, There was a coastal reference available: the lighthouse at Whitefish Point, a light visible at great distance under normal conditions. And there was a radio beacon, a fixed signal that onboard navigation equipment can use for a bearing toward shore. When the Fitzgerald attempted to use that beacon, she found it offline. A power failure ashore had silenced it. In a storm, infrastructure on land can fail as readily as equipment at sea. With her own radar gone, the radio beacon gone, and visibility near zero, the ship was now almost entirely dependent on external guidance. In those hours, the sea wasn't only striking the ship, it was dismantling her. Topside damage, a fallen railing. Lost ventilators suggested wave impact strong enough to tear away attached elements. That may have been solid green water passing over the deck. It may have involved floating debris. It may have been the combined result of repeated impacts and hull flexing, because a long freighter flexes. In heavy seas, part of the ship may rise over a crest, while another section sinks into a trough. That uneven distribution induces stress throughout the structure. Engineers describe that flexing with two terms. When the midsection rides higher than the ends, the hull arches upward, tensioning the upper structural members. When the midsection rides lower, the reverse applies. These patterns of stress are not theoretical, they're felt as vibration, as metallic groaning, as changes in tension across the deck. In extreme conditions, repeated flexing can contribute to localized failures or to the weakening of seals and closures. The ship wasn't poorly built, but the energy of a sustained November gale can demand more than any design fully anticipates. As evening fell, the Anderson itself was struck by a series of exceptionally large waves, a sequence the captain never forgot. In his account, those waves were of unusual size, capable of covering elevated portions of the ship with solid water. That observation feeds a phenomenon well known on Superior: the possibility of waves significantly larger than the prevailing average, arriving one after another in sequence. A series like that, reaching a ship already listing and already taking water, could be the final push. Even so, the Fitzgerald was still on the radar, still responding, with transmissions that sounded measured and controlled. She reported difficulty, but she was making headway. Less than 40 miles separated her from shelter. On a freighter, 40 miles isn't a lifetime, but in a November gale, it can be a very long distance. Long enough for an electrical failure to worsen, long enough for water ingress to outrun the pumps, long enough for the sea to change the equation entirely. In the last known transmission, the Fitzgerald responded in a tone of quiet, professional steadiness. The sound of a ship exhausted, but holding. Calm in the voice doesn't correct a list. Discipline on the bridge doesn't change the weight of water on deck, but it does tell us that, until that moment, the crew was still working, still trying to reach shelter, still trusting their training and their ship. Shortly after, the echo of the Fitzgerald disappeared. First from sight, then from radar. And that absence became data in itself. The Anderson, expecting to see her lights between its own position and the coast, saw nothing. Radios were checked. Calls went unanswered. Other vessels were consulted. Nothing came back. The night had closed in, and the lake was still running hard. The Anderson contacted the Coast Guard to report the loss of contact. On shore, available resources were inadequate for those sea conditions. Small craft couldn't have operated in that swell. Aircraft would take time to deploy. And on the water, the first real response could only come from other freighters. And so the Anderson received the hardest and most natural request in a maritime emergency: turn around and search. Turning around in a gale means taking the sea head-on, losing almost all forward speed, and accepting direct blows to the bow. It means risking your own ship for the possibility of finding some trace of another. That decision is made knowing you may find nothing, and also knowing that if anyone had any chance of surviving in that water, time was the only resource that mattered. The Anderson came about. fought back toward the area where the echo had vanished, and began searching searchlights, sweeping a dark and irregular surface. The William Clay Ford joined the effort. The Coast Guard coordinated from shore and deployed aircraft when conditions allowed. But on the water, the work was slow. In high seas, an object can vanish into a trough and reappear on a crest only for a moment, a matter of angle and timing. The night stretched toward morning. When light finally came, the lake revealed what it could no longer conceal. Scattered debris, oil slicks, survival equipment, damaged. Everything pointed to a loss that had been swift and without margin. The search continued, but it did not find survivors. The Fitzgerald was no longer a ship in transit. She was a position on the lake bottom unknown in her exact location, unreachable in that moment, surrounded by questions that would take months to begin to order. The voyage had become an investigation, and the storm had become a data set. The goal was no longer to reach port. It became something else entirely: to understand what failed, what held, and what ran out of time. With the first light of day, Lake Superior revealed a different version of the same storm. The wind was still present, and the swells still demanded caution, but the clearing allowed visibility beyond the narrow arc of a searchlight. For the Arthur M. Anderson and the William Clay Ford, the search shifted from a blind sweep in darkness to methodical work, covering sectors, holding minimum safe speed, and watching the water with the patience of those who understand that a large object can stay hidden in the valleys between crests. In that phase, every piece of evidence functioned not as an answer, but as a coordinate. An oil slick doesn't explain how a loss occurred, but it confirms a ship was there and that her integrity is gone. Floating debris, scattered and recognizable in shape, doesn't tell the sequence, but it bounds an area. That distribution is called a debris field. Objects spread across the surface by wind and drift, elongating in the direction the weather has been pushing. Drift itself is the movement driven not by the engine or rudder, but by wind and water acting on whatever floats. The search had a clear physical limit. Lake Superior in November carries water cold enough to cut survival time to minutes. Even with a life jacket, the window is very short. The freighters working the search didn't need to say that out loud. It was visible in how they moved: cautious speed, brief communications, repeated patterns, even as the probability of finding anyone alive quietly disappeared. Coordination from shore attempted to organize resources, but the lake set its own pace. Fast response vessels weren't built for those seas. Aircraft offered broad coverage but depended on weather windows and the quality of available light. From the air, the search follows a simple visual logic. Fuel slicks, colors that don't belong to open water, shapes catching light. From a freighter's bridge, the search is more intimate and slower. The horizon sits lower. Waves block the view. The eye adapts to repeating patterns and can miss a detail without disciplined, deliberate observation. As the morning advanced, certain findings began to tell a story. Survival equipment was found in damaged condition. On a freighter, lifeboats and life rafts are designed for controlled deployment. If they appear crushed or deformed, that usually means they weren't launched in an orderly way. They were either torn free by the sea or exposed to forces beyond their limits during a rapid sinking. That kind of discovery reduces the likelihood that any extended window had existed for an organized evacuation. The devastating realization that the ship was entirely lost didn't happen all at once. It arrived as accumulated signals and the absence of others. No radio contact, no persistent radar return, no lights in the night where lights should have been, and the morning brought no silhouette of a drifting hull. At that point, the Edmund Fitzgerald stopped being a communications emergency and became a case of total loss. When a vessel disappears into deep water, the work that follows divides into two planes. The first is human. Notifications, crew verification, coordination between the company, authorities, and families. The second is technical, reconstructing, from incomplete data, what may have happened. In the Fitzgerald's case, that technical work became especially intense because the ship was large, well-known, and had carried, until that day, a reputation for strength. The available data from the final hours came from three primary sources: meteorology with wind and wave records, and the acknowledgement that the storm's track forecast had failed. Radio communications offering specific phrases about damage, pump operation, list, and radar loss. And the Anderson's radar navigation, which provided relative positions throughout the crossing and the moment the echo ceased to exist. With that foundation, the first challenge was locating the wreck site. On a lake of that size, an estimated position can carry accumulated error, and in a storm, that error grows. A radar echo can degrade from interference. A rudder can overcorrect. A strong wind can push a bow off heading. Even with a reasonable last known position, confirming the exact location on the bottom required a separate search. That's where sonar became central. Sonar emits sound pulses underwater and measures the returning echoes, allowing estimation of depth and detection of objects on the lakebed. Unlike radar, which uses radio waves in air, sonar uses sound in water because sound travels efficiently in that medium. In deep water, sonar can trace a detailed relief map of the bottom, and an object as large as a freighter shows up clearly in that relief. Locating the wreck wasn't only a matter of technology, it was also a matter of conditions. The search area had to be manageable, operations had to be stable enough to run safely, and the framework from reported positions and surface debris had to be reliable enough to narrow things down. Even so, the lakebed isn't a smooth floor. It has irregularities, sediment layers, and acoustic shadows that can confuse. Identification required repetition, comparison, and confirmation. When a shape consistent with the Fitzgerald was finally detected, the discovery opened another stage: seeing, in some form, what was lying down there. The site was at significant depth, and depth imposes two hard constraints: pressure and darkness. Pressure increases steadily with every foot of descent. Sunlight stops penetrating long before the bottom is reached. Any visual observation depends on artificial light and on water clarity, which at depth is often limited. To observe a wreck at those depths, specialized systems are required. In the history of the Fitzgerald investigation, a remotely operated vehicle was used, a platform equipped with cameras and lights, connected to a surface ship by a cable, transmitting images and responding to remote control. The advantage is clear. No diver needs to be placed in an environment that, at those depths, is entirely beyond the reach of conventional diving. The first images of the Fitzgerald, when they came, couldn't be perfect. Illumination was limited. Sediment rose easily. Even so, those images were sufficient to establish a fact that would change both the public and technical conversation. The ship was not intact. She had broken into two main sections, bow and stern, separated. That single observation resolved nothing. In fact, it opened new questions. A ship can break upon impact with the bottom. She can also break during the descent under severe stress, especially if one section fills with water while another retains partial buoyancy. So, the question was not only whether she broke, but when and how. To approach that answer, investigators considered the distribution of the cargo. Taconite pellets, being dense, settle quickly when released. If the ship sinks nearly vertically, the cargo tends to fall close to the wreck site. If a section floats briefly or opens during descent, the distribution can spread wider. The pattern of pellets around the wreck became a data point to interpret not a definitive answer, but a marker. At the same time, formal investigations took shape. The United States Coast Guard, in its role in maritime safety and response, the Lake Carriers Association, representing operators on the Great Lakes, with deep operational and technical experience, And the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, an independent agency that investigates transportation accidents and recommends safety improvements. The result was a coexistence of assessments. They did not fully align. And that divergence is part of why the case was discussed for decades. One point of controversy centered on the hatches. One hypothesis suggested that hatch covers may not have been properly secured, which would allow water to enter the cargo holds. Beyond being difficult to prove, that reading carried a serious implication. It shifted part of the cause toward procedures aboard a ship whose crew could not respond. Over time, post-wreck observations indicated that hatch covers appeared correctly secured, not eliminating the possibility of deformation under extreme load, but making a simple, negligence-based explanation hard to sustain. The investigation increasingly shifted toward physical damage, rapid flooding, and an accelerated end. A key distinction helps frame what that means. Gradual flooding allows time for a distress call, time to prepare equipment, time to redirect toward shore. Rapid flooding takes the ship from degraded to irreversible in very little time. The absence of a Mayday, combined with the nature of the debris found, was consistently interpreted as fitting a rapid end. The afternoon's transmissions had already described a struggling ship. List to starboard, pumps running without gaining ground, 2 ventilators lost, deck damage. All of that describes a vessel in a difficult but still moving state. The gap between that and total disappearance was the blind spot the investigation spent years trying to fill. In the technical conversation, 2 families of hypotheses emerged. One focused on contact with a shoal or reef, and later analysis revealed that Canadian depth surveys of that shoal had contained errors. The shallow area extended farther than charted, narrowing the real clearance margin for a deeply loaded freighter in heavy weather, where vertical motion amplifies everything. A bottom contact can open a breach below the waterline, and that kind of entry doesn't depend on wave action over the deck. Even if the wind eases, water continues entering as long as outside pressure exceeds internal resistance, and the breach remains open. The crew's own words, water coming in as fast as it was being pumped out, fit a significant entry. It doesn't prove contact, but it keeps the possibility in play. The second family of hypotheses centered on exceptionally large waves in sequence. In a storm, a series of outsized waves can deposit large volumes of water on the deck. If the ship is already listing, that water concentrates toward the low side and toward the bow. That weight high and forward increases the bow down lean. As the bow drops lower, the next wave strikes higher and carries more mass, and the cycle reinforces itself. In that context, the forward hatches could be subjected to loads they were never designed to sustain. If they give way, the sea enters directly into the hold, and in a ship where the hold functions nearly as one continuous space, that entry changes everything rapidly. There was also a more integrative reading, and arguably the most realistic from an engineering standpoint. Not one cause, but a chain. Initial damage producing list and reducing margin. Loss of ventilators, allowing water into spaces it shouldn't reach. Pumps holding without recovering. Electrical or navigational degradation. And then a sequence of large waves delivering the final blow. In that reading, the ship isn't lost because of a single error. She's lost when multiple layers align and the margin disappears. While those hypotheses were being considered, the wreck acquired a particular status. Underwater. A site like this is a place of respect, not a tourist attraction, but a location bound to human loss. Over time, objects recovered from the ship became part of a memorial. The ship's bell was recovered years later and displayed at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point, near where she was lost. That bell is rung in annual commemoration once for each of the men who did not return. In maritime safety, learning isn't only measured by finding a definitive cause. Sometimes it's measured by introducing new barriers. In the years that followed, meaningful improvements were implemented. Greater availability of survival suits, more systematic vessel tracking, changes to freeboard policy, and expansion of the meteorological measurement network on Superior. Before the disaster, the lake's weather coverage was significantly thinner. The growth of buoys and sensors made it possible to understand how wind and waves behave in near real time. On a lake that changes quickly, that information is a safety layer in its own right. Something else changed too, a certain attitude toward invulnerability. A freighter can be engineered to withstand tremendous forces, but there is no indestructible vessel. Lake Superior does not negotiate with reputation. It responds only to physics, to margin, and to decisions made under uncertainty. The Fitzgerald, which for years had been a symbol of scale and confidence, remained as a reminder that size does not remove the fragility hidden inside any chain of systems. At the bottom of the lake, the two sections remain where they fell. Above, at the surface, the story holds itself together with partial data, careful inference, and respect. On the bridge of a freighter, many decisions are made without drama, a course change, a radio report, a speed adjustment to gain shelter. In this case, those decisions were part of an effort to sustain a crossing through a storm that reorganized itself faster than the forecasts ever anticipated. And so, when we look back at that final passage, what remains is not a single scene, but a map of margins closing, one by one. A ship reporting a list, and pumps that can't gain ground. A radar going dark. A beacon on shore failing in the wind. A sheltered bay less than a final stretch away. And an echo on a radar screen that, in one quiet moment, simply stops being there. When the Edmund Fitzgerald moved from an emergency to a position on the bottom of Lake Superior, the investigation faced a fundamental constraint. There was no internal record of what had occurred. In aviation, a flight data recorder is the first thing investigators reach for, but on the freighters of that era, there was no universal equivalent capturing every parameter from the bridge and engine room. Without that kind of record, the case rested on external evidence: meteorology, communications, radar traces, surface debris, and eventually the direct observations of the wreck itself. From that foundation, three primary perspectives took shape. The first was that of the United States Coast Guard, which in addition to its response role, participates in maritime safety and issues regulatory guidance. The second was that of the Lake Carriers Association, an organization representing Great Lakes operators, carrying deep operational and technical knowledge of the system. The third was that of the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, an independent agency that investigates transportation accidents with the single goal of recommending safety improvements. All three perspectives shared a starting point. The ship was lost in a severe storm, and she had already shown signs of damage, list, and water entry before she disappeared. Where they differed was in explaining the leap between a degraded state that was still navigating and a sudden disappearance that left no time for a distress call. A significant part of the debate focused on the hatches, because the hatches are the boundary between the sea and the cargo hold. Each cover is designed to resist wave impact and a certain amount of water on deck, but it isn't built to sustain, for extended periods, the deep accumulation of solid water pressing down on it from above. When the sea repeatedly delivers more than the cover was designed for, the steel can yield. And if deformation alters the seal or fractures the frame, water stops seeping in slowly and begins entering all at once. The Coast Guard explored the possibility that some hatch covers had not been properly secured. That hypothesis sought a straightforward explanation. Flooding starts at the deck and flows down into the hold. The difficulty was twofold. First, it was hard to support with solid evidence. Second, it implied a procedural failure aboard a ship whose crew could not respond. Post-wreck observations ultimately indicated that hatch covers appeared correctly secured, not eliminating deformation under extreme load, but making a simple negligence-based explanation difficult to maintain. The NTSB developed scenarios in which the loss would not be consistent with slow, progressive flooding. That reasoning rests on the absence of a distress call and on the fact that the Fitzgerald, until very shortly before she vanished, was still communicating and still making headway. In gradual flooding, there is typically a recognizable moment when the crew understands the situation is beyond control and sends the call. The absence of that moment suggested a faster end. To understand why rapid flooding is so feared, consider what the hold of a bulk freighter actually is. In the Fitzgerald, the hold volume was enormous and functioned nearly as one continuous space. If water enters that volume with force, the ship can lose buoyancy within a very short time. Buoyancy is what keeps the ship afloat, the hull displacing enough water to support its own weight and cargo. When water invades spaces that should contain air, that upward force is lost. If flooding concentrates forward, the bow drops lower, the sea strikes higher, and the cycle drives itself. In parallel, the Lake Carriers Association gave weight to a different idea: contact with a shoal or reef. A known hazard exists in that region of the lake. Later analysis revealed that Canadian surveys of that shoal had contained errors. The shallow area extended farther than charted. That changes the real clearance margin for a deeply loaded freighter, especially in a storm where vertical hull motion amplifies effective draft. A bottom contact can open a breach below the water line, and that kind of entry is especially dangerous because it doesn't depend on wave action over the deck. Even if the wind eases, water continues entering as long as outside pressure exceeds internal resistance, and the breach is open. The crew's words "water coming in as fast as it was being pumped out" are consistent with significant entry. Not proof of contact, but consistent with it. Here, a structural concept helps connect certain damage reports to a possible bottom contact. A long freighter behaves like a beam. In heavy seas or when partially supported over a shallow point, the hull flexes. When the midsection rides higher than the ends, the upper structural members are under tension. A railing doesn't simply fall from a wave. It can fail if the hull deforms enough to stretch what's above it, beyond its normal range. The Anderson's captain, hearing the report of a fallen railing and a list, read those signs as consistent with either a bottom contact or severe structural stress. That was informed professional judgment, not laboratory proof. But it was coherent with the idea that the Fitzgerald had experienced something that changed her structural condition, not just waves coming over the side, but an event that altered her integrity. In reviewing the wreck, early descriptions noted minor damage in the lower portion of the stern section. That raised a question. Was this evidence of a graze on the shoal, or the result of impact with the lake bottom during the sinking? In technical investigation, that distinction is difficult when examining a hull that has descended hundreds of feet, broken apart, and struck the lake bed. Damage compounds upon damage, and without high-quality early imagery, interpretation stays open. Efforts to verify the shoal contact theory included inspecting the shallow area for marks, scrapes, or paint transfer. No clear evidence was found. That absence doesn't disprove the hypothesis in heavy seas. Contact may be brief and leave no definitive signature. The result was a hard-to-resolve equilibrium. No hypothesis was fully eliminated, and none imposed itself with definitive force. Meanwhile, the hypothesis of exceptionally large waves retained its plausibility for a simple reason. There was credible, direct testimony to waves of extraordinary size in that same time window. The Anderson described a series of waves large enough to cover elevated portions of the hull. If that wave train moved through the same corridor of the lake, it was entirely reasonable to believe it reached the Fitzgerald, which was running ahead. On an inland lake, waves can grow through superposition when wave trains align and combine. A wave significantly larger than the prevailing average changes the balance of forces, and when those waves arrive in sequence, the ship has no time to drain and stabilize before the next one arrives. If the Fitzgerald was already listing to starboard, that detail becomes pivotal. A sustained list causes water on deck to concentrate toward the low side. That accumulation doesn't just add weight, it raises the effective center of gravity, reduces stability, and increases the force holding the lean in place. The long, exposed spar deck can hold water when drains are overwhelmed, and that weight acts as additional load on the very hatch covers that separate the deck from the hold. Later examination of the wreck noted that some forward hatch covers showed deformation and indentation patterns consistent with heavy downward loading. That evidence doesn't prove a wave caused it. Deformation can also result from descent or bottom impact. But it keeps open the possibility that the forward deck received water accumulation exceeding its design range. By that point, the case had moved into territory where the most honest framing was one of chains, not isolated causes. A plausible chain. Deck damage opens a water path into tanks or tunnels. Lost ventilators allow the sea to enter spaces that shouldn't fill uncontrolled. That produces a list. The list increases deck exposure to water. Water accumulation increases load on hatch covers. If a cover yields, entry into the hold accelerates, and in a ship where the hold is nearly continuous, the effect multiplies. The radar loss fits that chain too. Radar depends on stable electrical power and protected equipment. If water reaches interior wiring or control spaces, circuits can be compromised. And in blowing snow with poor visibility, losing radar is not just an inconvenience. It forces navigation with reduced awareness of hazards and coast. The Fitzgerald's request for radar guidance from the Anderson confirms that the crew regarded their situation as serious enough to depend on another ship's screen in that final stretch. The Whitefish Point radio beacon failure on shore also fits not as a cause of the sinking, but as the removal of yet another layer of navigational safety. In safety engineering, those layers function as redundancy. When one is lost, the rest become more critical. In this case, the ship lost her own radar, lost the coastal beacon, and was operating in near-zero visibility. What remained was the Anderson's guidance and the Fitzgerald's ability to stay stable long enough to make the final approach. One detail sometimes overlooked: the Fitzgerald slowed at some point, allowing the Anderson to close some of the gap. That can be read as tactical cooperation. It can also be read as a symptom of degradation. A ship with structural problems may reduce speed to lessen wave impact, reduce hull stress, or simply because she can no longer sustain full power without additional risk. Slowing in a following sea also changes the wave relationship, potentially allowing a crest to catch the stern at a different angle. In the final window, the Fitzgerald was still transmitting with professional composure. No signs of panic in what was recorded, only language suggesting sustained difficulty. That tone is important. It shows the pattern common in critical operations. The crew continuing to work within their training, right up until the system crosses a threshold. When that threshold arrives, it can arrive very fast. The sudden disappearance of the Fitzgerald from the Anderson's radar screen reinforces the case for an abrupt final event. A ship sinking slowly may continue returning. Radar echoes through part of the process. A ship that loses buoyancy rapidly and descends bow first can vanish in minutes, leaving an interval too short to coordinate a mayday, especially if power or communications are already compromised. In reviewing the positions of the two wreck sections, investigators considered a scenario where the bow descends first, drives into the lakebed, and the stern retains residual buoyancy for a brief moment before following. In that kind of sequence, the break may occur during the descent, when the arrested bow and the still-moving stern are forced apart by inertia and weight. At those depths, pressure increases rapidly, and water invades spaces that held air. The structure experiences forces that don't exist at the surface, making the final shape of the wreck a difficult guide to what happened above. For decades, the debate continued because the case couldn't be closed with a single element. Expeditions added imagery. Deformations were observed and analyzed. The condition of covers, frames, and ventilators was studied, and a central understanding held. There is no solid basis for attributing the loss to any single, simple human action. The decisions on record shifting to a more protected route. requesting radar guidance reflect careful management. The problem wasn't poor intent. It was a convergence of extreme conditions and margins that narrowed until there were none left. On the Great Lakes, safety doesn't rest only on surviving storms. It rests on anticipating them, measuring them, communicating their development, and adjusting the policies that determine how low a ship can ride. That's why, in the aftermath of the Fitzgerald, changes were made to meteorological coverage, to survival equipment requirements, to vessel tracking systems, and to the way freeboard was understood, not as an administrative figure, but as a physical distance that separates a ship in control from a ship in trouble. The Fitzgerald remained as a reminder that a crossing can hold for hours in harsh conditions and still end with a rapid break when multiple layers fail at once. A ship reporting a list and pumps that cannot gain ground may be running a quiet race against time. And in that race, the final approach to shelter can be the most demanding stretch because the sea doesn't become gentler just because land is near. Sometimes it becomes more confused, more crossed, harder to read. The investigation returned not a single answer, but a map of reasonable possibilities, a set of lessons, and a series of improvements incorporated over the years that followed. And it returned, also, a quiet way of looking at risk. Not as a mystery requiring drama, but as a system demanding respect for margin, for maintenance, for measurement, and for humility before a lake that, in November, can feel like an ocean. As the years passed, the work surrounding the Edmund Fitzgerald became more precise, more patient. The early expeditions had served to locate and confirm. The later ones sought to understand. In a deep wreck, understanding means studying the geometry of the break, the orientation of each section, the way the steel edges bent, and the relationship between the hull and the lakebed. That lakebed is not an abstract surface. It carries sediment, irregularities, and gentle slopes that affect how an enormous object comes to rest after a long fall. In that kind of descent, physics changes progressively. Pressure increases with every foot of depth, seeking out every space containing air and forcing water inward through any available opening. So, when interpreting a deep wreck, a careful distinction must always be made between what may have happened at the surface and what occurred during descent and final impact. A deformation on a hatch cover may be the consequence of water loading during the storm, but it may equally be the result of forces during descent or of collision with the bottom. Damage compounds upon damage. In that range of uncertainty, method matters more than assertion. Still, certain questions hold steady because of their operational relevance. The first is the origin of the water entry that produced the list. The second is why the situation moved from difficult but manageable to irreversible within a short interval. And the third is the relationship between the damage reported by radio topside damage, lost vents, pumps running without gain, and the final disappearance without a Mayday. In that reconstruction, it helps to return to the afternoon when the Fitzgerald reported damage. The fallen railing, the lost ventilators, and the list to starboard form a connected picture. The railing is not only a safety element for crew moving on deck, it also functions as a physical edge that guides water toward drains and prevents it from moving freely. If a section is lost, water can travel differently, striking exposed equipment and reaching places it shouldn't reach. The lost ventilators, for their part, are direct openings into internal spaces, spaces not designed to flood, without control. Water entering a ballast tank through an open ventilator has a clear effect. The tank, instead of filling through controlled valves, begins to fill continuously from the sea. That adds weight to one side and shifts the center of gravity. The ship leans toward that side, and even a small degree of list changes how waves strike the deck. A surface that previously received water symmetrically now receives it preferentially on the low side. And when the low side receives more water, the lean sustains and may increase. Pumping capacity, in that context, becomes a race against the rate of entry. Pumping doesn't eliminate the cause, it only reduces the symptom. If water is entering through a large breach or from below the waterline, pumping can reach equilibrium without ever recovering ground. The phrase in the transmission water coming in as fast as it was going out describes exactly that equilibrium. And in safety terms, that equilibrium is inherently unstable. A small increase in entry, an electrical failure, or a wave adding water where it can't be handled may be enough to tip the balance irreversibly. That connects directly to the radar loss. On a ship, radar depends on electrical power, on cabling, and on protected equipment. If water reaches interior spaces or wiring near the bridge, circuits can be affected. A partial electrical failure can also compromise pumps, lighting, and communications. In a storm, the risk isn't simply that water enters, it's that water enters in the wrong place and compromises the very systems that maintain control. Meanwhile, the environment continued acting on the Fitzgerald with particular persistence. A following sea waves pushing from behind can seem favorable because the ship doesn't receive head-on impacts. But it carries its own demands. The wave lifts the stern, then drops it, and the long hull flexes like a beam in each cycle. With a maximum cargo load, the mass of ore in the holds adds inertia, resistance, to rapid changes in motion. The result is cyclic stress absorbed by the structure thousands of times over the course of a single storm. This isn't a single wave. It is a sequence that, over time, can amplify an initial damage. For that reason, many modern reconstructions avoided selecting a single hypothesis as the final answer. Instead, they concentrated on the plausible chain that best fits all available data. A plausible chain begins with an initiating event that causes deck damage and opens a water path into tanks or tunnels, a green water impact, a floating object, a structural deformation under stress. What matters is the effect. Exposed ventilators, water entering, sustained list, pumps working without gaining. The chain continues with gradual erosion of margin. A ship with a list has reduced capacity to drain deck water. If drainage is overwhelmed, water lingers. That weight on deck increases load on hatch covers. And if the ship is already riding low from reduced freeboard and heavy cargo, waves arrive higher and more frequently. At that point, the forward deck may begin receiving increasing volumes of solid water. Here, a simple concept becomes important. The vertical load on a structure is the downward force pressing on it. A hatch cover, though robust, has a range for vertical loading. In moderate seas, water arriving on deck spreads, drains, and doesn't linger. In extreme seas, water accumulates, and the load becomes sustained. Steel deforms when force exceeds its elastic capacity. If deformation alters a seal, water enters through the hatch. And if it enters into a large, continuous hold, the change in buoyancy is rapid. That rapid change is exactly the kind of event consistent with the absence of a Mayday. A distress call requires time, requires the radio to be operational, and requires the bridge crew to have a moment to recognize that control is gone. If the transition takes seconds or a few minutes, the ship can move from navigating with difficulty to losing buoyancy with no moment to act. In that scenario, the crew doesn't necessarily make an error. They may simply run out of time. The way the wreck came to rest in two sections was interpreted with this logic as well. If the bow floods first, the bow descends. The stern, for an instant, may retain buoyancy. That difference creates enormous tension at the midsection, one part trying to go down, the other still resisting. That tension may produce the break during descent, and when the bow strikes the bottom, the remaining energy of the motion reinforces the separation. In looking at the distance between the two sections, some imagined a surface breakup, the ship splitting above water. But most technical analyses didn't need that image to explain the distribution. A deep descent with a driving bow can produce separation and relative displacement without a complete break occurring at the surface. What matters is the compatibility between forces and observations, not a dramatic visual scenario. In discussions about shoal contact, the central argument always came back to reduced margin. A freighter with a deep draft, in seas with large vertical amplitude, can approach the bottom more closely than static draft suggests. The difference between actual depth and depth shown on older charts, even if small, can become critical in the wrong moment. The absence of clear marks on the shoal prevented that hypothesis from being closed, but also prevented it from being confirmed. In contrast, the exceptionally large wave hypothesis had a strong anchor, direct testimony to extraordinary wave heights in the same time window. And there was an additional element. The Fitzgerald had reported that water was passing over the deck. When water passes over continuously, the deck becomes a flow channel. Persistent flow can produce enough forward accumulation to drive a pronounced bow-down lean. That lean causes the bow to enter the water more deeply and receive more water. It is a feedback loop, and feedback loops don't need someone to make a mistake. They only need conditions to align. Even without settling on one cause, the investigation produced clear results. Safety improvements were identified and implemented. Immersion suits, available in each berth, reduce preparation time in the event of a sudden abandonment. More meteorological buoys gave the lake a monitoring network it had never had before, real-time readings of winds and waves, allowing captains to make decisions with less uncertainty. And more reliable position tracking meant that even if a ship went silent, her last known location could be confirmed, reducing search area and response time. The institutional response changed as well. The recognition that the Coast Guard had been limited by available resources in that storm generated pressure to review capabilities and contingency plans. In such an event, the first hour is critical. The Fitzgerald's loss accelerated that conversation. In that framework, the case became a permanent reference, not as a story-feeding mystery, but as a set of lessons about safety layers. The meteorological layer, the maintenance layer, the hatch closing layer, the navigation equipment layer, the communications layer, and the response layer. Each can fail for different reasons. What makes an event critical is the coincidence of degradations across multiple layers in the same window of time. The soberest lesson from the Fitzgerald was understanding that risk doesn't concentrate in a single moment. It builds through loading decisions, through maintenance states, through tolerances accepted as routine, through imperfect forecasts, and through the very understandable desire to finish the season before winter closes the lake. In that understanding, the final hours appear as a sequence of layers wearing thin. The meteorological layer fails in precision. The freeboard margin compresses under full cargo. The deck integrity shows weakness in exposed ventilator openings. The control layer holds with pumps that cannot recover ground. The navigation layer loses its radar. The coastal reference layer loses its beacon. And the final approach, instead of offering relief, demands that control be sustained just a little longer. In the hours after the disappearance, the search operated without certainties. A datum was established, an estimated position from which probable drift of debris could be projected, built from the last radar echo, the last radio report, and estimated speed and heading. From that datum, search patterns were calculated and adjusted as daylight brought new reference points, and the questions that would take months to answer were only beginning to take shape. When the Fitzgerald slipped from the horizon and from the screens, the Great Lakes community entered a mode it knew, but which is never simple, converting a loss into procedure. At the surface level, that meant coordinating searches, logging reports, confirming identities, and managing communications between the company, authorities, and families. At the technical level, it meant something else. Transforming fragments of information into a coherent account, solid enough to extract concrete measures. In that kind of investigation, the operative word is consistency. A hypothesis may be compelling, but if it doesn't align with the available data, it becomes noise. So as documents were gathered, statements reviewed, and bottom imagery compared, the case began organizing itself around questions that could be answered even if only partially. The first question was meteorological. What kind of storm was this? How did it behave? And why did the forecast fail? The second was structural. What signals point to water entry? And where might it have begun? The third was continuity of systems. Why was radar lost? What affected power and communications? And how much real margin existed to recover control? The fourth was a policy question. What rules allowed a ship this heavily loaded to ride this low? And what did that mean for the margin of safety? The storm, viewed with distance, was not a single entity. It was an interaction between a low-pressure system, air temperature, and the lake surface. Wind doesn't only create waves, it creates a wave pattern. When wind holds steady, the lake develops a dominant series. When wind veers, those series can cross. A crossing sea presents a ship with irregular forces, blows from ahead, lateral pushes, and asymmetric lifts that demand constant correction. For a long ship, those varied stresses accumulate. In the Fitzgerald, the first recorded sign of degradation was the list to starboard. That alone doesn't identify a cause, it only says that something changed in the distribution of weight or in where water was entering. But the list was reported alongside 2 damaged or lost ventilators. If those ventilators served ballast tanks, the connection is direct. An open vent allows the sea to fill a tank without control. If they served an access tunnel, the consequence is equally clear. Water enters a longitudinal space and can travel, affecting compartments and cabling. On a ship, the electrical system is not a background detail. It is the nervous system carrying power to pumps, radios, lighting, and navigation equipment. Water in a passageway or tunnel can reach electrical panels, cause short circuits, and force circuit isolation. A short circuit means current is flowing along a path it was never meant to follow. And protecting against it often means shutting down the very circuits you need most. In a storm, an electrical failure doesn't require explanation. It only requires water in the wrong place. The Fitzgerald's radar loss was one such consequence. The radar system depends on an antenna, a transmitter, receivers, and stable power. The antenna sits high for maximum range, and in heavy weather, it can suffer vibration, water impact, and icing, with its cabling affected if water reaches internal routing. When both the primary and backup radars are reported lost, what is described is a ship that has lost her primary means of orientation in a world of blowing snow and zero visibility. In that condition, the Fitzgerald turned to another layer: radar guidance from the Anderson. That practice is possible because a nearby ship can see the other vessel's echo and compare it to coast and hazards. But that guidance is less precise than self-navigation. It depends on reception, quality, communication, clarity, and the stability of both vessels. In snow and spray, even the guiding ship's radar can be saturated by wave returns. The Whitefish Point radio beacon, which failed due to a power outage ashore, would have offered another reference. A radio beacon emits a steady signal that receivers aboard can use to take a bearing, even without visual contact. When that signal disappears, a coastal anchor of position is lost at exactly the moment when shallow hazards demand the most precision. Even so, the most important element of the sequence was not any single instrument loss. It was the sum. A ship, already listing and already pumping without gaining ground, reaches a point where any additional degradation accelerates the process. That's why, in evaluating the possibility of rapid flooding, many investigators focused on a design characteristic that in normal conditions goes unnoticed: the large, nearly continuous volume of the cargo hold. When water enters a large compartment, the effect on buoyancy and stability can be abrupt. If entry occurs through a hatch that yields, or through a breach below the waterline, the ship can lose the capacity to maintain level trim very quickly. And when she loses that capacity, the lean increases. Water enters with greater ease, and the cycle feeds itself. The language reported from the Fitzgerald, "We are taking water," and listing, suggests an intermediate state, a ship still responding, but with degraded performance. That state can persist for hours if the entry rate is limited and pumping compensates. It can also end quickly if the entry rate suddenly increases from new damage, from a larger wave, or from a pump going offline. What does a pump failure actually mean on a working freighter? The bilge pumps are typically powered electrically, with capacity measured in volume per unit of time. If a pump loses power, develops a blockage, or suffers valve damage, total pumping capacity drops. If the ship was already in an unstable equilibrium, even a partial loss may be enough to cross the line. That line appears in the investigation as the point at which the Fitzgerald suddenly vanishes. The disappearance of a radar echo isn't direct proof of sinking, but combined with the absence of lights and the finding of debris, it is a strong indicator that the end came fast. Subsequent work descended to the lake bottom. Later expeditions produced higher quality imagery and more detailed models of the wreck. In recent years, digital modeling tools have allowed three-dimensional reconstructions, sometimes called digital twins, to be built. A digital twin is a computational simulation of a real object that allows its shape and condition to be explored under various scenarios. For a ship, it can help visualize how stresses distribute, how water accumulates on deck, and how stability changes as the hull sustains damage. These tools don't solve a mystery on their own. They improve the ability to compare what we hypothesize against what physics would actually produce. In parallel, the Great Lakes safety system began to change. One of the most direct changes was the expansion of meteorological measurement. Weather buoys, floating platforms that measure wind, pressure, temperature, and wave height. Transmitting that data in near real time gave the lake a monitoring network it had never had. With more measurement points, intensifications, and directional shifts can be detected before they become crises. Anticipation doesn't eliminate the storm, but it improves every decision made before and during it. Survival equipment requirements were also strengthened. An immersion suit slows heat loss in cold water, extending the window of survival until help can arrive. On a lake like Superior in November, that extra time may represent everything provided there is any opportunity to enter the water with the suit on. Position tracking advanced as well. The AIS system, Automatic Identification System, now widely used on commercial vessels, shares identity, position, heading, and speed with nearby ships and coastal stations in real time. Its value is twofold. It reduces collision risk, and it maintains a last known position, even when voice communication has failed. In a search, reducing the area of uncertainty reduces the time to find someone, and reducing that time in cold water can be the only thing that matters. The review of freeboard policy was part of the legacy as well. Freeboard, the gap between the waterline and the main deck, is better understood when seen for what it is: the safety margin from incoming water. Less freeboard means more efficient loading, but it also means more frequent arrival of solid water on the spar deck in a storm. Adjusting that policy means accepting less cargo or more restrictive operating conditions in heavy weather. In industrial shipping, those changes carry costs, but they also carry reduced risk, and the Fitzgerald made the cost of ignoring that calculation impossible to overlook. With all of this, the investigation did not return a single answer. It returned a map of reasonable possibilities, a set of hard-won lessons, and a series of improvements incorporated over the years that followed. The Fitzgerald's final hours, from the list and the failing pumps to the dark radar screens and the silent beacon, became a reference used in every subsequent conversation about how systems fail and what it takes to keep them from failing together. And so the case moved forward, not toward a closed verdict, but toward a deeper understanding of what margins mean on a body of water that, in November, demands that control be sustained just a little longer than the ship has left to give. Time, on Lake Superior, does not erase the facts. It only makes them cleaner in what is essential and more intricate in what remains uncertain. with the Edmund Fitzgerald. That complexity held for decades because the case was suspended between two legitimate needs: the need to understand with rigor what may have occurred, and the need to accept that, even with rigor, certain pieces will simply never exist. On the most immediate level, the loss created an operational void. A freighter of that size does not vanish without the entire system feeling it. Routes continued, docks continued, cargoes continued, but with a different attention to margins. November navigation, already known for severity, acquired added weight, not from fear, but from technical memory. The kind of memory that transforms itself into checklists, into revised policies, and into more careful conversations before a ship leaves the dock. The loss also left a lesson about the nature of evidence. In maritime accidents, where there is no complete internal record and no witness from the lost vessel, investigation depends on indirect indicators. In the Fitzgerald's case, those indicators were primarily the radio transmissions and the account of the Arthur M. Anderson, its sequence of contacts, its observation of damage reports, and its record of the moment the Echo disappeared. To that were added weather measurements, surface findings, and eventually observations of the wreck at depth. From that foundation, the major investigations followed different paths in some areas, while converging in others. They converged on the absence of definitive proof of a surface breakup. They converged on the ship ending in two sections, a separation explainable by forces during descent and impact with the lakebed. And they converged on the final event having been fast enough to account for the absence of a last distress call. Where conclusions diverged was in the initial mechanism and the exact point at which the margin disappeared. One family of hypotheses put the focus on damage from contact with a shoal, a breach, below the waterline. Another put the focus on a sequence of extraordinarily large waves, deck water accumulation, and possible hatch failure under excessive vertical load. And a more integrative reading combined elements: initial damage generating list and water entry into ballast spaces or tunnels, pumps working without recovery, system degradation, and a final event that accelerated water entry past any point of control. Even after decades of debate, the most responsible position remains holding what the evidence actually supports and treating the rest as reasonable possibility, not certainty. What is supported? The Fitzgerald reported a list to starboard, reported damaged or lost ventilators, reported pumping without gaining ground, and then lost her own radar navigation at a critical point in the passage. The Whitefish Point radio beacon failed due to a power loss ashore, reducing available references at a moment of poor visibility. And the ship disappeared suddenly, in a severe storm, when she was relatively close to coastal shelter. That body of facts is sufficient to extract lessons without needing to declare a single definitive cause. In safety work, a lesson can grow from a probable scenario, even when that scenario can't be proven to laboratory precision. The useful question isn't always what happened in one specific minute. Sometimes the useful question is, what conditions allowed the margin to become so narrow that 1 minute was enough to lose everything? From that perspective, the case drove concrete changes. The expansion of meteorological buoys across Lake Superior transformed how the lake is read. With more data points, wind stops being a regional estimate and becomes a local, near real-time measurement, allowing intensifications and directional shifts to be detected with greater lead time. Anticipation doesn't eliminate the storm, but it improves every decision made before and during one. Survival equipment was also strengthened. The principle is straightforward. If an event is fast, equipment must be within immediate reach, not stored somewhere that requires a search in the dark. Immersion suits in each berth, paired with consistent training, create an additional possibility in a scenario where the available minutes are few. It isn't a guarantee. It is one more barrier in a chain of risks. The culture of tracking and position verification also changed. Knowing where a vessel is and maintaining a reliable last known position helps direct resources faster. On a lake as large as Superior, reducing the area of uncertainty is reducing the time to find someone. And reducing that time can be decisive in water that cold. The discussions about freeboard less visible to the public were equally important. That gap between the waterline and the main deck is better understood as a safety distance from incoming water. Less freeboard can mean more cargo efficiency, but it can also mean more frequent arrival of solid water on the spar deck in a storm. In the Fitzgerald story, that relationship became impossible to ignore, not because she was necessarily unsafe by design, but because margin becomes a dominant factor when waves are large and persistent and the ship is loaded to her limits. On the human level, the legacy took a sober form. The Mariners' Church in Detroit maintained its tradition of commemorative bells. At Whitefish Point, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum held the memory with the recovered bell and a space that treats the loss as it deserves, with respect and with quiet. The bell is not made into spectacle. It becomes a symbol of something real, a reminder, without needing to describe scenes, that 29 men lost their lives and that the lake, in November, does not grant second chances when the continuity of systems breaks. And the story was carried far beyond the region by Gordon Lightfoot's iconic ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the most recognized songs in American folk history. For millions of Americans who grew up in the 1970s and 80s, that song was the first time they ever heard those words. It planted the image of Lake Superior in November into the cultural memory of people who had never once seen the water, and it kept the questions alive long after the official investigations concluded, in the way that only music can. At the technical level, the Fitzgerald left a reminder about how systems degrade. A ship is not held together by one single thing. It is held together by layers: meteorology, maintenance, closures, stability, pumping capacity, electrical power, communications, instrument navigation, coastal references, coordination with other vessels. Each layer can compensate for failures in another, up to a point. The danger appears when multiple layers degrade within the same stretch of time. On that November night, the layers degraded in succession. The forecast didn't accurately describe the storm's actual track. The sea grew to a level that put solid water on deck in a sustained way. The Fitzgerald reported damage and list. The pumps worked without recovering margin. The radar stopped functioning. The radio beacon ashore went dark. And the final approach toward shelter, instead of offering immediate relief, demanded that control be sustained just a little longer. That little bit more was the difference between reaching Whitefish Bay and disappearing. With all of this, the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald can be told without insisting on mystery and without dramatizing the loss. It can be remembered for what it truly is: a defining tragedy of operating under extreme conditions where the physics of wind and water meets reasonable human decisions, and where a narrowed margin can become irreparable when a final event accelerates things beyond any possibility of control. And so the lake remains. The docks remain. Ships still cross. The difference is that when November settles in again and Superior changes its tone, the technical memory of the Fitzgerald accompanies every route plan, every bridge conversation, every verification of seals, every wind reading, not as a shadow, but as a quiet, steady form of discipline. Rest well. When the morning finds you, we'd love to hear which mystery you'd like to wander into next. If these quiet journeys speak to you, Silent Journals will be here. Until then, sleep peacefully.